Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler, and my guest today is Chris Jennings. And Chris is going to talk about the books that he has written about the AIDS crisis. So take us back like to the 80s, Chris, when this first came on, people became aware of it. And people were dying, a lot of people were dying at that time. So give us a little history of AIDS.
Okay. Well, it's, people now who grew up in a later time don't realize how frightening and how horrific the beginning of the AIDS epidemic was. We had these young people who were previously healthy suddenly falling sick and dying in a matter of months, or in some cases, a matter of days. A big killer was a pneumonia called PCP. I'm gonna give it the Latin word, and that was killing a lot of people. You go into the hospital on a Friday, you'd be dead on Monday. And of course, this is normally a pneumonia people only get after they have an organ transplant because they suppress the immune system, and that is allowed to grow. It's a fungal infection. And then they had things like herpesvirus infections, where we're literally eating up people's bodies, just like a scientific horror film. And people were frightened, and it was scary, and people didn't know where it came from. And doctors took different viewpoints. Some of them did not take protection. Some of them would deal with these patients wearing moon suits, like astronaut suits, to protect themselves because they didn't know where it came from. We didn't know the cause. We didn't know how it was spread. And
Mm-hmm.
in this vacuum of knowledge, all kind of ideas and theories came forth.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was that it was a immune system overload because many of the first people to get it were IV drug users or gay men, and they had been exposed to so many different. The idea was they had been exposed to so many pathogens, so many germs from sexual behavior and sharing IV needles that it overloaded the immune theory, which I never went for because in history there's been people like this. You would have seen it in prisons probably, or prisoner of war camps, or in starvation. All these circumstances where people's immune systems are overloaded, crowded, the ghettos, the tenements of the 18th century in Europe. And it took 3 years, and actually very early in the epidemic, the Centers for Disease Control figured out that it was obviously a transmissible disease caused by some infectious agent, even though it took them 3 years to find out what that agent was. And how they did this is when you have diseases like this, there's a network of epidemiologists. Epidemiology is the study of disease in populations. So every state has a state epidemiologist office. And for instance, when I was young, about 15, 16 years old, I got food poisoning at a fast food restaurant. When I was in the hospital, one of these state epidemiologists came and interviewed me to find out where I got the disease. And then they would send the health inspectors to this restaurant. So in the same way, when all these IV drug users and gay guys were sick and they were in the hospital, they were interviewed by the state epidemiologists, and they figured out that this was obviously an infectious disease by some unknown pathogen, some unknown germ, and it had an incubation period. Even before they knew what it was, they had figured out the incubation period was roughly 18 to 24 months. Okay, so all this 10-year incubation period is nonsense. I can go into where it developed, but it's nonsense. Even before we knew
Okay,
what it was. Okay,
okay. I gotta ask you something.
sure.
As with the COVID, there's all different theories about its origins. Some people, I believe it came from, the wet market. Some people believe it escaped through, the laboratory. Do you and what the people that think it escaped through the laboratory consider it a man-made disease? Do
Okay.
you do you consider AIDS? Because a lot of people have theorized that. Do you consider AIDS man-made?
Well, first, let me speak to the coronavirus, okay? Because Robert Redfield, who was the director of the Centers of Disease Control, said, I believe it was on Frontline, that the COVID virus obviously had a genetic segment that could only have been developed in a laboratory. Okay, so that's the director of the Centers for Disease Control who soon lost his job. And he's also testified in front of Congress. So obviously the COVID virus passed through a laboratory before it became epidemic in humans. Okay. Now for HIV, I didn't pursue that path. I am open to all kind of theories. And as far as I'm concerned, the monkey origin is nonsense. We can talk about it later. So I don't think there's been a true investigation into the origin of AIDS. And I can't claim to know the pedigree or the history of HIV before it entered the human domain. Obviously, it existed somewhere before it existed the human domain, but we don't know where, and the monkey stuff is nonsense. But it's a popular theory, and people to understand that there's a guy, a dead famous scientist called Stephen Jay Gould, who back in the 80s was a very big, you see him in Time magazine, he was a very big geneticist who was at Harvard, and he's quoted, one of his basic themes was, you cannot separate science from the societal beliefs of its time. Okay, so I think that in the 80s when HIV came out, many doctors and scientists were afraid it was a laboratory virus, and they loved the African theory because it put it way over there, somewhere else, and it was not something that us nice, westernized, civilized people got. It was from dirty, awful Africans who had sex with monkeys, and that's actually, to me, Africa is blame black people for AIDS part 2. Blame black people for AIDS part 1 was Haiti. That was where they first thought it came from, which is nonsense. And then they switched later to blame black people for AIDS part 2, and that's Africa. We'll talk about that later. Okay.
Mhm.
So what I say is I do not know the history or the pedigree of HIV before it entered the human domain, but the disease AIDS obviously started in New York City and it spread around the world from New York City. So New York City is the epicenter of the global HIV/AIDS epidemic. And if you do what I've done, which no one else does, is go into the medical literature and spend 2 years reading it and collating data, you find that this is obvious. And it's not the World Health Organization, it's not UNAIDS. No one else has done this homework, and of course, no one pays for it, which is why it doesn't happen. But I'm a writer, and that's like a dog with a bone. So I spent years doing 40-hour days putting this together. And if we talk about that, well, basically, I should talk about where my knowledge comes from my books, and it's
Okay.
basically the scientific literature. So I went at first, spent, as I said, 2 months, 3 months at Harvard Medical School, spent $2,000 in dimes photocopying 2,000 scientific and medical journal articles to
Mhm.
write my first long book. I wrote a book at first through interviewing scientists, realized you couldn't trust them, went to the medical literature, wrote a long book. And then I went back and years later and went to a medical library when it's all PDFs and downloaded 3,000 PDFs, general scientific articles, and wrote my second and third and fourth books, which we'll talk
Mhm.
about. But so my knowledge comes from the scientific literature. I've never been to Africa. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a researcher. I'm a writer. I have a degree in biology from Harvard, a bachelor's degree. I'm a nothing in the scientific world. But
Mhm.
what I've done is go to the scientific literature and I did my homework, which is why the story I tell is so much different from what you hear through the media and unfortunately through a lot of the scientific literature. Although, again, the societal beliefs, if you're a research scientist and you find evidence that came from Africa, you'll get published, you'll get accolades. If you think it came from rats or chickens or perhaps from cows or horses, which have similar viruses to HIV, you were shut down. And some scientists did do this. When they were talking about the African monkey, green monkey being the source, other people came up with, wow, this is very similar to the bovine leukemia virus. And
Mhm.
they found 30 to 40% homology. That's the history of genetic. It's done genetically now, but it's a way of measuring historical. How to say it? Historical connection is the wrong word. I'm losing the scientific literature terminology, but it's a way of seeing how close your ancestors are is homology. Before, I'll stop there. It goes
Hey,
on forever.
but if it started in New York City,
Right.
then the theory with the animals doesn't carry water as far as I'm concerned.
Well, again, HIV has cousins in other mammals. Okay, so yes, monkeys in Africa have retroviruses, a certain type of virus with an RNA core, not a DNA core. Okay, yes, there are monkeys in Africa that have retrovirus that share about 50% homology, genetic homology with HIV, not particularly a lot. Okay, but we also have, before HIV came out, we knew there were certain, well, retroviruses are not very common with humans. Before HIV affected humans, there were only 2 known retroviruses that affected humans. One was human T cell leukemia virus 1 and leukemia virus 2. And they were common to certain populations in Africa in certain populations of Japan, just very limited and unknown viruses. Okay. But we also had the, I have to, I have it here. I just want to, the other American relatives of HIV are the Madai-Wiesner virus in sheep, the caprine arthritis encephalitis virus in goats, the equine infectious anemia virus in horses, which is spread by mosquitoes. Every year in Massachusetts, now every few years in Massachusetts, someone gets it through mosquitoes in southern Massachusetts with other horse farms. There's also the bovine cow. It's now called the immune deficiency virus. Before it was called the bovine leukemia virus. And we have everything's immune deficiency now. Before, naming things gets you funding. So now in virus research, everything is an immunodeficiency virus, where before they had other names. Okay. So there's also a feline immunodeficiency virus, not related to HIV at all. And there's the simian immunodeficiency virus, which are the African ones. So we have already these economic animals, sheep, goats, horses, cows, that had cousins, if I say it that, of HIV. Okay. They're retroviruses. They have long incubation periods. There was no cure for them. And historically, what you did is you had a herd that was infected with one of these, you destroyed the herd and burned it. Okay, but when it happened in humans, of course, we had to find a way to solve it. And retroviruses are very common. They're in goats, they're in horses, sheep, cattle, pigeons, rats, mice. I forget what else. They're very common in other animals. And they're mostly known, as I said, in ungulates, which means hooved animals. So those are the economic animals of sheep, horses, goats, and cows, all with hooves. Okay, so there's this whole, so realistically, we have HIV developing, we have AIDS developing in New York City. We should look for, if we're going to use the zoonotic transmission of disease from animals to humans, if we're going to use the zoonotic theory, we should look for a zoonotic source, an animal source closer to New York City. And of course, that's sheep, goat, horses, and cows. So to me, a possible theory, science fiction, I have no background for this. How could that have happened? Okay, we don't have to have evil scientists working with HIV, okay, and giving it to humans. We could have a laboratory in New York City, a university laboratory where in this, if you worked in these old university buildings of science, you have a hallway and offices off each side. This guy's working on genetically modified tomatoes, the first ones we had. This guy's working on heart disease. This guy's working on cow viruses. This guy's working on human viruses. This guy's developing a vaccine for, what do you call it? Hepatitis B. Now, before we had AIDS in the 80s, we had a big epidemic that was a precursor, like a model for AIDS in the 70s. There was a big hepatitis B epidemic among gay men, IV drug users, and the follow-up population are hemophiliacs, okay, because they take blood product collected from thousands of people, okay, and also the other high-risk groups are healthcare workers who are exposed to bloods and needle stick accidents. So we had a big epidemic, and it was a big problem for that, and they tried to develop a vaccine for it, which wasn't possible. But there were a lot of experimental approaches to creating a hepatitis B vaccine, and many gay men in New York and other urban centers were given different experimental vaccines. Okay, so possibly one of these vaccines could have been contaminated with one of these viruses from one of these economic animals. Okay, that to me is a plausible, possible scenario with no proof it's science fiction. Because in science, there's many biological happenstances. We don't control, we don't know where did HIV come from beforehand. We don't know where did it exist before humans. I don't think we've really looked at it, but it was somewhere and somehow it got crossed paths with the human domain and entered the human domain in pretty obviously in New York City. Okay,
Why do
around
you say New York City?
Well, because that's where, okay, well, back when things came out and there was a big stuff in the news, there were 4 or 5 gay guys in the hospital in Los Angeles who all had this unknown immunodeficiency disease.
Okay.
And that was HIV/AIDS. We didn't know what it was at the time. It didn't cause it. So people think it started in LA, but actually the first cases that were reported in real time happened in, I think, July or April 1979 in New York. So the first
Okay.
cases, the world's first legitimate AIDS cases, and I go back to literature and I look for what I call legitimate AIDS cases, not this, oh, it was in Africa, or it was here, we found a case here in Zaire, we have found a case here 50 years later, 20 years later, 5 miles apart. HIV is a transmissible disease. It must happen in clusters, like the flu. Okay, flu happens wintertime, billions of people get it. You don't have a case of the flu here in New York City or there in Washington, D.C. months later. It has to happen in a cluster, many people at once. So they have all these cases, they go back in the literature and they find what was HIV in Africa in 1960s, 70s, 50s. Nonsense. Okay, burst out in New York City. And the first cases, in my point of view, of one, it happens in a cluster. It's got to be more than one. And two, it has to have the classic AIDS-defining diseases. Okay, AIDS is not a catch-all for immunodeficiency. Immunodeficiency was well known before AIDS, like the boy in the bubble syndrome. People born with what they call aplasia, without a functioning immune system. Also, if you have leukemia, it kills your white blood cells. You're more susceptible to infection. Okay, you can have primary or secondary immunodeficiency. So HIV is primary. Infections from leukemia is secondary to leukemia. So the first cases that had my characteristics, clusters and AIDS-defined disease. Oh, I should say, HIV does not affect all the immune system. It affects what's called cell-mediated immunity, also known as cellular immunity. Okay. On the other side, the blood-borne component of the immunity is called the humoral immunity. So humoral immunity fights against bacteria, and that's primarily with antibodies. HIV affects cell-mediated immunity, which protects the body against fungus infections, viral infections, protozoan, single cell and multi-cell parasites, and also against cancers. Okay, so HIV only impacts cell-mediated immunity. So the initial AIDS-defining diseases are always fungal, viral, or protozoan.
Okay.
Okay, and that's the problem with the African AIDS patients. They don't have these. They have bacterial infections. And the classic AIDS-defining diseases we have in Europe and America, the African AIDS patients don't have. AIDS exists in Africa, and AIDS is basically an urban middle-class disease around the world. But all these poor people that they test positive all through Africa, it's just the blood test gives an avalanche of false positives in the tropical population of poor people who have other diseases. Okay, that's my take on it.
How did you get interested in this subject?
Well, I was pre-med and decided not to go through the abuse of medical school. And I was going to get interested
The what of medicine?
Abuse.
Okay, that's
okay. I had enough. My history is I had enough. Okay, I finished Harvard. I got out. I got my BA. I got out. No more abuse. Thank you for education. Okay, but it's also my particular situation I will go into. And I started writing. I wanted to write about the environment. I thought that was the most important thing. And then I was recruited to write high school and college textbooks. And then I realized the money's in writing for industry. So I got into writing about medical devices in the Boston area. So a lot of analytical medical devices. And also I got into writing, I write now basically for the pharmaceutical industry. I do regulatory documents for the pharmaceutical industry. So when HIV/AIDS came out, I just knew it was important. I just knew instinctively, this is not some strange thing. This is something that's going to be very important. And I wanted to write about important things. And oddly, everybody thinks I'm Black, I have AIDS, I'm gay. And I'm like, no, I'm a biologist. I'm interested in health and science. So that's how I got involved. And I knew it was going to be very important. So let me go in. So my first book, I interviewed scientists in the Boston area around the world. And I developed these two books. Well, this is my first booklet. It came out in '86. And they're now available free on my website. And they're in PDF form, so they're free. The first one was bought and used by Massachusetts General Hospital, MGH in Boston. That's the hospital affiliated with Harvard Medical School. And they bought 1,500 copies, one for every clinical unit in the hospital and one for every department head of every clinical unit in the hospital. It was also used for staff education at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center, which of course is the institute that cares for the President of the United States and the top medical center and research center of the Department of Defense. So that was the history. That's where I started. So I realized, talking to some doctors later who I interviewed and researchers, that when they talk to me, They say things that are hearsay, but when they write things, it's more solid. So that's when I went back and I did the 2 years research and um, spent $2,000 in dimes, photocopying stuff in 2 years, and I wrote a bigger book, same title, that was 240 pages, and that one was reviewed favorably by the New England Journal of Medicine, also used at leading hospitals around the world for staff education. Okay, so then I went back after years. Of course, I went bankrupt. No good deed goes unpunished.
Mhm.
And came back, and the story drove me crazy about the Africa and all this stuff. And so I went back and I spent 3 years writing my next couple books, downloaded 300,000 PDFs and went through them, and came up with my current books, for which I'm ignored and treated like a leper, in which I came up with 3 tenets studying the medical literature. So for me, given a sober review of the medical literature, one, New York City is the epicenter of the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Okay.
It started from New York, spread around the world. We'll go through that now. Two, the theory that HIV came from monkeys is a fallacy. Okay. Again, people get published for supporting the societal belief it came from over there and not with us decent people. Okay. And if you went to some conference, I talked to people who said, gee, I went to an HIV conference, a medical conference in Boston, and the guy said AIDS came from black people in Africa having sex with monkeys. That's what they said. Okay. So that's number two, it's the monkey fallacy. And three, the African AIDS epidemic as Holocaust never happened. Okay, for instance, South Africa was a big center of HIV, and they had 1 in 4 infected. In fact, I have a New York Times article here. 1 in 4 people in Africa infected, and obviously 25% of Africa did not die. 25% of South Africa did not die between 2001 when they say it and 2010, with the 10-year incubation period. Nonsense. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So that's the story. So let me start with the first tenet. This first story, New York City is the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic.
Okay.
Again, the first legitimate patients were in New York. And then among the first 1,000 AIDS cases in the United States, 465 AIDS patients were in New York.
Okay, when these people first went to the hospital,
Mhm.
the staff, the doctors, the nurses, they had no idea what they had.
Exactly. Yeah. So basically, there's a publication in which I'm a weirdo. I've been subscribing to it since I was 18 years old. But the Centers for Disease Control has a publication, they don't have it now, it was called Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. Okay. And basically, it's a tool of the state epidemiologist network to report things that pop up. Okay. So the guys in New York were finding, basically it can be anything. It can be, the flu, it can be a cancer, it can be food poisoning, right? And they report what they find because it's sort of an alert network to make people aware across the country of what's happening. So in June 81, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, MMWR, reported on the 5 gay guys in the hospital in Los Angeles who all had this strange immunodeficiency disease, and it took off. And of course, who reads the Morbidity and Mortality Report? Journalists. So of course, bang, New York Times has it. All these people have it. It hit the news in June 81. It was not until 84 they determined it was a virus that caused it.
Okay.
Okay. So we had all these people. So doctors had different approaches. Some of them went into an AIDS patient's room dressed normally. Some of the people went in with astronaut suits on to protect against any airborne infection because they didn't know how it was spread.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in fact, initially, let me just go on because the first cases, basically, it started in New York, it grew from New York, and then the first cases migrated overseas. So it went from New York City to Europe first. Okay, and the first places where HIV demonstrably happened, and it came from the States because the people in these locations either came to the States and had sex with gay guys in the States, or in their own countries, they had sex with gay guys from the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first cases where HIV migrated over the Atlantic happened in Denmark, United Kingdom, France, West Germany, and the Republic of South Africa.
Mhm.
So the first two AIDS cases legitimate AIDS cases that happened in Africa were two white guys who were air stewards who flew the Johannesburg, New York City route.
Wow.
Okay. All right. That's the story.
When you think about, you know, AIDS in Europe and England, the first thing that comes to my mind is Freddie Mercury. And had there been the drugs that they have now, he would not have died so young, right?
Well, it took a long time. Yeah, it took a long time for the drugs to be developed because they didn't know what caused it. You
Okay.
know, and Denmark was a big epidemic. The first case found outside the United States was a 51-year-old gay guy from Denmark who had been coming to New York and going to the bathhouses and nightclubs in New York for 10 years. Now, people don't realize New York was like Disneyland for gay people. In fact, I separate things down between homosexual and homosocial, right? Like when I grew up, a bunch of guys would sit around on Saturday, watch football games, drink beer, no women allowed. That's homosocial.
Okay.
Okay, so there were people who are gay, and some of them are about sex, and some of them about social. So we have homosocial people who get married and live together because they're homosocial. And then there were what I call the gay party animals, and they're the ones who think that New York City it was Disneyland. All
Okay.
right, so you could go down to Christopher Street on Friday, Saturday night. There's 50,000 gay guys from all over the world and from 50 miles outside of New York coming in. You have bathhouses where you can have sex with 10 guys a night, or the nightclubs and all this stuff. This is all the stuff that came out, and it's not all
All
gay
over the
people.
world.
Yeah, New York City was, yeah, many of the first AIDS cases were foreigners. The people from Israel, from Pakistan, from South America, because New York City was Disneyland. If you were into the gay party scene, in fact, Denmark, I deleted, I should have kept a quote. Oh, here we go. Here's a quote from Acta Medical Scandinavia, medical journal. The high rate of travel of Danish homosexuals to the USA might explain the high rate of AIDS in Denmark, which is at present the highest reported for citizens in a European country.
Wow.
Okay, so a lot of gay guys from New York would go to party in New York. A lot of guys from Denmark would go and party in New York. And there's all this statistical stuff that correlates it and, okay, whatever, but it's just pretty much known. Okay. And here's another thing. We're talking about the AIDS cases in Denmark. 3 of the cases were the first reported in patients who had not previously visited the United States. Okay, so it came to Denmark, and then it settled there, and then people in Denmark got it from other Denmark people. So the 3 cases reporting of these Danish cases are the first cases reported outside the United States where they didn't have sex with a man from the United States. Listen to this quote. This indicates that the disease can be acquired outside the USA.
Uh-huh.
Okay, they didn't know what it was, and they didn't know
Right.
what caused it, and at first it was all in the United States, and they didn't even know whether you could get it outside the United States. Maybe it was something about the United States that people got it there.
Mm-hmm.
And here they're saying, wow, we have it now in Denmark, and these guys didn't have sex with Americans. They had sex with other Danish people, and we now know you can get it outside the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the name AIDS was developed before we found out what it was, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the state network of epidemiologists had gone and interviewed all these patients, and they figured out it must be acquired because they had the sexual contacts. They went and interviewed, what do you do? What do you eat? What do you do? Da, da, da. Do you take drugs? Da, da. You have sex? And they would try, and then you're supposed to track the sex partners, which happens, it doesn't happen always, but they would track the sex partners and interview them. And then, of course, they found out there was obviously something that was passed to person, and they could see the incubation period was 18 to 24 months. And this all came out before they knew what it was.
Okay.
Okay. So, passing along. So also we have AIDS. So we have AIDS migrates over the Atlantic to Europe and to South Africa. And there's another thing here that blood products the United States is the biggest importer and exporter of blood products. So we're going to talk about basically factor 9, or it's 8, I forget which is a product needed, a clotting factor needed by hemophiliacs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So also American blood products exported AIDS to other countries. Okay. So not only were gay men traveling, gay tourists spreading it, or people coming to the US for the party animal scene in New York, gay party animals, we also have American blood products, factor 9, transmitting HIV to other countries. So it's now, we found out that American blood products exported HIV to Scotland, to Denmark, and the Republic of South Africa.
Okay.
Okay, so it's demonstrated that compared to local products, they would compare the product from the US with the product developed from blood locally, and it was always the product from the US that had a higher rate of
Mm-hmm.
transmission. In Denmark, Scotland, and South Africa.
Okay.
Okay, so it's been demonstrated that it was an epidemic. And we have all these things. France, the highest rate of HIV seropositive was observed in hemophiliacs who received factor VIII concentrates prohibited from plasma, collected mainly on the American continent. Okay, the overall prevalence of AIDS in the treated American hemophiliacs is about twice that in Europe, but in countries that use factor VIII concentrate from the USA, the incidence is likely to increase. So all this evidence is that New York, the States is the epicenter, and the States is New York. So even like years later, I can't remember that. I have stats here. I'm not going to share with you, but at one point it's like 220,000 cases in New York, and the nearest behind it is I think San Francisco with 120,000, something like that, or 80,000. It's really a big difference.
Mm.
New York was the epicenter, and it had the super. We had a gay scene in L.A. and a gay scene in San Francisco, but New York had the hugest industrial gaze scene. Remember, they had people came for the sex clubs and the sex stuff. So we had newspapers that reported it, and it was an industry, a sex industry for gay tourism in New York City. That's why it's the epicenter.
And
Okay,
the other big cities in New York didn't have that. San
well, the other
Francisco,
cities had it,
Los
but there's nothing.
Angeles.
There's nothing compared to New York.
Okay.
I mean, American gay guys aren't wusses. They party. This party scene was a big party scene, right? And there's nothing compared. Americans do it higher, faster, better than everybody else. So
Okay.
if you were from Pakistan, if you're from New York, you're from San Francisco, you're from Japan, and you're a gay party animal, you want the drugs, the sex, the fun, you come to New York City. It's Disneyland. And that's the story. That's why it spread around the world from New York City.
And people from all over the world knew that New York was the place to go.
For parties, not to get HIV, but for parties, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. If you're into that, it's like everything else, whatever you're into. If you want to go skiing, Colorado, the Alps,
Right.
whatever. If you're into the gay party thing, right, the sex thing. If you're from Europe, probably France is a good place, but it was kind of France. I understand was more closed. It was more of a neighborhoody thing,
Okay.
right? And then outside New York, the biggest epicenter was what I call the Paris, Brussels. Brussels, Belgium, and Paris were the second largest epicenter outside New York. And going back to the 70s and 80s, New York and Paris were very well connected, right? Because Paris was the cultural center of the world. Now Hollywood is, but back through post-World War era, Paris fashion, Paris food, that was the connection, right? So Paris and New York had a very close connection. And outside New York, with its numbers, the second largest quantity was in Paris and, excuse me, including Brussels. Brussels has two languages, French and what do you call it, Flemish. Okay, so what we have here is a francophone, a French-speaking epicenter. And so it went from New York to the Paris-Brussels cluster, and then disease follows trade routes. We know this since the days of the sailing ships. Disease follows trade routes. So from Paris, we had HIV transmit to the Francophone colonies, the French-speaking colonies of Africa. That's how HIV got to Africa, through the Paris-Brussels cluster. So the first Black AIDS patients, now the first two who got AIDS in 81, 82 were white guys from South Africa who worked on airplanes, air stewards, and flew the New York, Johannesburg route. The first Black Africans to come down with legitimate AIDS were residents of Belgium. Okay? They didn't get it from monkeys. They got HIV from the nightclubs in Europe. So the disease spread from the Francophone epicenter French-speaking epicenter of Paris, down to Mali, Zaire, now Congo, and I'm forgetting the third one. I want to say Rwanda. That's not right, but the third francophone colony. Okay, that's where it spread. So the first legitimate AIDS cases happened in upper class men who were able to travel to Europe and party in Europe. The first legitimate AIDS cases in Africa were characteristically upper class men in Africa who could come to Europe and get diagnosed in Africa after having contracted HIV in Africa. I mean, excuse me, they were afford coming to Europe, both to party and way to get diagnosed. It was their wives, and then it was their children. So the first legitimate AIDS cases were upper class Africans, their wives, and their children. And the upper class Africans got the disease not from monkeys, but from party and European.
What year was that?
About 83.
Okay.
Okay, when it was diagnosed and first came out.
Okay.
Okay, so it happened, the first flourishing, what emergence was around 81 in New York. Okay, and same thing with Haiti. There's a guy who found genetic evidence that came from Haiti. Nonsense, too much to go into, but the methodology is very poor. He uses these old blood samples that are too old for valid analysis, and they make these new super probes to go in and pull out stuff out of this garbage, and they come up with things that are HIV. Who knows? And they're saying it came from Africa to HIV. That's not the way the world works. It's like, why do we have hurricanes in the Caribbean and Florida? Because the sun hits the Atlantic Ocean, heats it up too much, you get the cyclone starting, and the way the world spins, the storms come to the west. They come to Florida, they come to the Caribbean. Same thing. The world of epidemiology, of disease doesn't come from Africa to Haiti. There's no traffic there. It comes from New York down to Haiti. It comes from New York to Europe. It comes from New York to Africa. Okay, because that's where the traffic is. It follows trade and it follows business. And same thing in the Caribbean as where else. It was American gay tourists that spread it throughout Europe, spread it throughout the Caribbean, and Africa's less because it came more from the Francophones. Okay, so same thing in the Caribbean. Like I have a few quotes here from scientists and see if I can find them. So the Caribbean nations with the most AIDS cases were among those with the strongest economic links with the United States, mainly Bahamas, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Trinidad and Tobago, and Mexico. And in fact, back around 84, 85, 86, I have a chart I'm not going to show you. The country with the highest prevalence, that's the highest per 100,000, the highest rate per 100,000 was the Bahamas. Or the Bermuda, I forget. I have to look. Bermuda. Okay. Why? Because obviously, stereotypical New York City AIDS guys, educated, often self-employed, no wife, no children, money to spend, and that's Bermuda. So you have basically a gay population of Bermuda who would fly to New York and party, fly to Miami and party. Okay. And so Bermuda had the highest AIDS rate in the world in September 1986.
Wow. Chris, there's a lot more I'm sure that you could talk about. And we've been talking about for like almost 45 minutes.
Okay, I'll stop. I'm sorry.
So why don't we do another show and you go on from this point and talk about what happened next?
Okay, I'd love to. Thank you.
Okay.
We have basically discussed the monkey fallacy and the African fallacy, but thank you very much for your appreciation and your time.
Great. So you've been listening to Chris Jennings. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Issues That Matter. So if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Chris, you are dynamic.
Thank you. Thank you.
And
thank you for your appreciation. You're welcome.
I thank you everybody for listening.